Welcome to the International Classroom, where we bridge continents and bring educators from all walks of life together. I'm your host, Alex Gray, and today I'm joined by two brilliant minds in the podcasting and education space, Arthur Moore and Shane Leaning. Today's episode dives into how educators like you can use podcasts as a powerful tool for professional development. You're going to hear about how our guests started in the podcasting world, what makes podcasting special for educators, and how you can begin creating your own. Now, this episode is brought to you by Smart Technologies. And whether you're in a traditional classroom or teaching remotely, smart interactive tools like the Smartboard and Lumio software are making learning more engaging than ever before. You can check out more at smarttech.com and discover how smart is shaping the future of education. So, whether you are on your morning run, in the car, or catching a break between classes, sit back and enjoy this insightful conversation about how podcasts are transforming professional development in education. And hopefully you'll all be the same as this, because you must all have podcast voices as well. So you never start the podcast and it's like,
I've been told.
You go into that first few lines and it's like, yeah, that really doesn't sound like me normally, but it's my podcast voice when I do the introduction.
I think my podcast voice has become my voice, and I have a non-podcast voice which I occasionally break out, which is maybe more worrying.
What, like you had a voice before and then you decided to put that voice away when you realised your podcast voice was better?
I think it's because I secretly want to be a Radio 2 DJ, Shane, so I'm just always auditioning just in case someone's listening.
Are you just saying that your podcast voice is a better voice than what you had previously?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
We're all work in progresses.
Oh, that's that. You know what? There's the coach. That's the coach talking to us there, isn't it? We're all work in progress, guys. Speaking, what a way to introduce ourselves. So if you haven't guessed, by the way, everyone, first of all, thank you ever so much for joining us on the International Classroom. Joined by what can only be described as two other world-class podcasters. Literally are worlds apart at the moment, the three of us across different time zones. So gents, I'm going to go around because I'm kind of like this now. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. So Arthur, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Alex. So hello, everyone. So my name's Arthur Moore. I was a secondary maths teacher for a good number of years, taught in schools across the UK as well as internationally in Thailand. And then for the past three and a half years, I've actually left the classroom. And my go-to day job is I'm a full-time professional online tutor. So I tutor maths. And I've been doing that for a number of years now, working in the tutoring space, but still kind of working in education, which is really kind of my passion. Was lucky enough to win Tutor of the Year in the UK in 2024. And on the side of that, I run a couple of educational podcasts, and I've kind of been doing that for the same amount of time as I have since I left the classroom. So I co-host Tea and Teaching, where we talk about education and this big thing we're all passionate about. And then I run a smaller mini podcast called Tutoring Tips, where we just share tips within our tutoring community. So basically, Alex, I just really like talking about education. And that's hopefully what we're going to be doing about today. That's like my story anyway.
Like all good teachers, just like the sound of their own voice. Which brings us then on to you then, Shane.
Well, I don't know what you're saying there, but yeah. I guess I got with a weekly podcast, and I've just started another podcast a while back as well. Yeah, we get quite a little bit addicted to the sound of our own voice, and hopefully to the sound of others who we're talking to. But I'm really delighted to be here. I'm Shane Leaning. I'm worker. I've been outside of schools also for the last year. I'm as an organizational coach. I'm based in Shanghai in China, and most of my career has been in international education, actually. So working as a teacher, as a senior leader in school, and also as a regional leader across a group of schools. And that's kind of why a lot of the work I do is around organizational development, organizational coaching approaches to school development. And I work pretty much solely with international schools. And that's why my main podcast that I release every week is Global Ed Leaders. That's a podcast for international school leaders across the world. So we've got listeners across the world. That's been going for about a year and a half now. So still fairly new to the podcasting space, really. It feels, although on episode 75 this week, And then another podcast called Coaching Done Well, where I co-host with a brilliant guy called Jim Thompson, all about what coaching is done well in a school context. So absolutely love this kind of podcasting space. And I think, like you, Arthur, said, it's just great to be able to have these conversations and talk about what we love, which is education.
Definitely, which brings us to the kind of the aim of the podcast for today, isn't it? To really explore, and I've put there about podcasting, about podcasts. We want to share some of the insights that we've got and have learned over these last few years doing this trend. So interesting, as we start off, kind of what drew you both and initiated this desire and want to start a podcast? It's difficult when you've got three people on because you don't know who's going to ask first. So Shane, I realise I need to actually dictate this to someone, by the way. And as we spoke before we came on, no, Arthur, I'm not going to edit that part out, just so you know.
Excellent.
We'll go with that. It's natural. It goes with the flow. Shane, I'm going to ask you first then. What drew you to want to start a podcast?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I guess for me, it started a bit before, is in that what got me into podcasts in the first place. I just started listening to a lot of podcasts as part of my own professional development. And I think podcasts resonated with me because when I was kind of working as a teacher, and especially when I kind of got into middle leadership, I felt like I was juggling so much. I wanted to develop. I had all these books on my shelf. I'm like one of those people who loves collecting books and never gets around to reading half of them. So I've got like all the nice books, the big names on my shelf, struggling to read them, and was just kind of trying to find another way to kind of take stuff in. And I think podcasts are just that great platform because it's a media platform you can do while doing something else, which I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, I think it's pretty nice that you're able to put on a podcast while you're going for a run. Or I don't know if you guys have had it. Some people have said, listen on a run or in the shower. Some people say in the shower, which is kind of an odd thing to imagine, but so people do it. They listen while doing other things, don't they?
Yeah. That's it. Like, it's people have got speakers in bathrooms now, or you see people have said to me, "Oh, I've listened to it whilst I'm swimming," because now obviously you can get waterproof headphones for swimming. So it's like, yeah, fantastic. I mean, as long as you're listening, that's great.
Well, that's it. And the nice thing is then it's a bit more passive, and sometimes then you can hear an idea and go, "Oh, I really like that," and it kind of interrupts you, and you have to kind of quickly take a note or whatever, and you can come back to it later. But I just found that very useful for me. And in terms of kind of shifting into creating a podcast myself, I was just looking, I guess it was slightly selfish. I was looking for the kind of podcast I've created. I was looking for one where international school leaders get to explore specific leadership strategies and challenges bespoke to that particular context. So I thought, well, someone at work who I worked with just said, just have a go, just start one, see who you can talk to and see what happens. And it kind of happened as organically as that, really. It wasn't very strategic.
What about yourself then, Arthur?
So a little like Shane, like I loved podcasts. Even before I kind of got into educational podcasts or even just educational podcasts, like I was brought up on radio, like there was always the radio on at home. I would always choose to have the radio on rather than having the TV on or anything like that. So always loved podcasts. And then I remember reading an educational book, Craig Barn, How I Wish I Taught Maths. And that changed a lot for me as a teacher. And then from that, I discovered his podcast. And that kind of brought me into kind of this educational podcast world. And that kind of combined with, I always loved learning from others, but in those kind of informal chats in the staff room. I think the staff room is just this beautiful place in education, in schools, where like we learn from each other, but not like, hello, Shane, today I would like to learn about this. Can you teach me? It's just like, I'm struggling with teaching this. Can someone help me out? I'm struggling with connecting with this student. And I used to do this a lot with my co-host on Tea and Teaching, Mike Harwell, when we were working in the same school. And then we kind of went our separate ways in the world. Literally, I went back to the UK, he stayed in Thailand. And we kept having these conversations about education. And we were like, maybe let's record one. We'll put it out there. Kind of a bit of just intrigue, a bit of a hobby, see what goes on. We quite quickly worked out within about an episode or two that we needed someone else to learn from. Otherwise, it's just me and Mike talking. And that's kind of where I think we got into kind of having guests on and just kind of this. I was like, I can learn loads from these people. And it kind of tucked in with just I love podcasts. I love chatting about education. Oh, why not do a podcast about chatting about education? So I think that's kind of my uncomplicated story into that world.
Oh, it's a great story into it. Because I mean, kind of interested, like, I'm not going to dive into mine because I've spoke about mine and Drew when we get into it. It was basically one of those where it's like having a drink at Christmas time and just sort of said, let's start a podcast. And that's what we did. And in a long story short, so not as, I suppose, as inspired by you guys, but looking ahead then, if people ask you, because it's one of those things, I don't know if I get asked this a bit, like when people come up to you and goes, oh, I was an educational podcaster. What podcast would you recommend? I'm like, well, obviously mine, but is there anything out? If you were to recommend, let's say, some other educational podcasts, and Arthur, you kind of alluded to some anyway, but what would be the types of educational podcasts that you would be recommending to educate for professional development? So I'll start with you, Arthur. What would you, carrying on from obviously one you recommended, what other ones would you be recommending?
So it's not a podcast that goes on anymore, but it's an amazing back catalogue by Darren Leslie of Becoming Educated. And that was a huge influence kind of on me just when I was trying to start our own podcast. And what Darren does, he gets people who really know their stuff, are brilliant guests and are really clever people. And he just asks them the questions that his listeners want to know. But he does it from his own kind of background, bringing his experience. And it's a brilliant educational podcast with a real range of topics within education. You can go there, you can go through and go, I like that person. I like the topic they're going to talk about. I'm going to listen to that. And I think that's a brilliant podcast, Becoming Educated. And it's one I would always point people towards who are kind of haven't listened to an educational podcast. That's one I would kind of point out straight away.
Yeah. What about yourself, Shane?
Yeah, it's funny because I think with me, people ask me what podcasts I recommend, and I always find it quite a challenging question to answer. And the reason is I think there's a diversity of podcasts and there's a diversity of podcast listeners. So there are different types of podcasts that will appeal in slightly different ways. And one of them is, I always think, is about length. Like one podcast that I really, really enjoy, for example, is Ollie Lovell's Education Research Reading Room, ERRR podcast. But they are long. They are really long podcasts. Like they are long, in depth, like 2 hours podcast kind of thing. And that means you can really go into depth with it. But I not always necessarily would be the first one to recommend that because I don't know. I first need to know, when do you listen to a podcast? Like for me, most of my podcasts sit at around the half an hour mark because it's when I go for a run in the morning. That's when I like to listen to a podcast, and I know I've got about half an hour. So that's good for me. I know some people have commutes, and the podcast is meant to fit in that commute. And I know some people who like, those little bites that you do after, like in the TN teaching, kind of really tiny ones as well, like where you can just get a quick snapshot and a quick idea between something that you're doing. So I think there's kind of a range with podcast. And I think if you're just starting, you kind of have to experiment and find what works for you. For me, I've got like a few different podcasts that I listen to of different lengths that I can tune into depending on which mode I'm currently in. I don't know if it's the same for you.
Yeah, I have friends that listen to mine, and just like some of them go, "Can't you just make it shorter?" It's like, just bluntly like that, because they're just accustomed to they just want 20 minutes. They want a 10-minute or a 20-minute type of bite-sized thing, and then most people, but that's it. Other people, we kind of sit around 45 minutes to 60 minutes generally. But I'm probably in the same boat as you, Shane. Like when I listen to podcasts, it's a rarity that I will listen to one all of the way through, unless I listen to it in the gym. And I'm one of those where, you know what, I don't like listening to it in the gym because I just find it super distracting. I want something that is just loud and heavy and drums. That's it. That's my gym routine. So for me, the podcast is I'll listen to snippets in the car and I'll pause it and I'll come back to it. So I always, like, the ones that really got me into it was Diary of a CEO. I just really enjoyed originally Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett, just the types of people he had on from a science perspective and learning from it. And I was like, wow, I can learn from this. And it had really good value. And then you come to watch it and it's like, okay, the production value of this is super, super good. And that's one thing that I suppose from my side, I like the technology, I like the cameras, I like that type of thing from it. So I'm geekily like, oh, I like this. But then
you have the best equipment, by the way, Alex. You always look so slick. Arthur and I are not doing you justice right now.
There's only so much editing I can do as well. I'm sorry, guys. But that's because my hobby. I'm a real geek with it. I love, and I'll take this off. I'll go shoot. I'll go video. I'll go, whatever. And I love photography. So I have it as that. It's kind of I was always more into cameras and photography before I got into videography. And I just happened to have these things that could do this job for me. And I'm interested in it. But then people ask me, I was like, yeah, go listen to him. And I kind of like things outside of education, funnily enough. So I love the Kelsey brothers, New Heights. Listen to those two. And again, just the conversations, how they are naturally. I mean, they had Adam Sandler on the other day, and it was just so funny. But again, it's really well put together. And they talk about their niche and what they talk about. Even though it's American football and a few other things, it's like they know what they're talking about. So I kind of like those combinations of people who can add value, who are experts, if you use that word, but in their field, or have really good experiences in those fields. So for me, it's a variety. The other one, I can't remember the lady who does it, but it's called How to Fail. And I just find those types of things quite insightful to then go, can I bring business ideas, or can I bring psychological ideas or, well-being ideas into the classroom to help? Because, we do get, from an educational side, sometimes we do get a lot of things. We do get this evidence informed and these PD ones and read this. But, actually what we're saying is that, and what we're here to talk about is that podcasting is a tremendous form of professional development. And hopefully what we've gained from that is it doesn't always have to be purely educational. It can be, a range of different things. So, thinking about that now, how would you recommend, so Shane, I'm going to go, how would you recommend curating content for educators on podcasts?
Yeah, this is a challenge. So I'll tell you what I wouldn't recommend. I wouldn't recommend just kind of going onto your podcast app and just searching for something, because I really feel like the podcast app searches are just absolute naff. Like they really can, they can really run up just random stuff. Like often you'll search education podcast, and you'll click and it'll be like a podcast that hasn't been updated in 5 years will be at the very top. I'm not quite sure how the algorithms work for these searches. So I think when I first started trying to find podcasts, I would do a lot of searches in the app. But where I've actually had better success at finding podcasts is speaking to people. It's always through a recommendation, through someone who I know. So have you listened to this, or have you found this, or someone's recommended or posted about something online, and I've taken that recommendation. And I think that's probably the best place to start. If you're thinking podcast could be something that I want to kind of use more for PD, start by asking people, what do they listen to? It's likely that there are a few of your colleagues in the staff room who listen to some education podcasts, and they may have done a bit of that filtering beforehand. Because I don't know if you've been through that, but I've definitely been through the phases where you end up downloading loads of different podcasts and thinking, which one am I going to like? And then you have to kind of start filtering, listening to a few. No, that's no good. That works for me. To find the one that actually resonates with you. Yeah,
I agree. It's hard also, isn't it? Because it depends on what your focus is when you are going through professional development. So, like you say, you could have a really good one, but then go, does that relate to what our school's aim is, school mission? What about my own personal side of it? It's a challenge with it. What about yourself, though? How do you, because obviously you're looking at it from an educational perspective and a tutoring perspective. It's like, do you find there's a difference between what those people want, or is it actually a very similar thing?
It's that really interesting thing where the content is quite similar, like the actual core content, but they want it delivered in a way that speaks to them. And I think that's really important for you when you're looking for a podcast that's working for you. You want a podcast that kind of speaks to your context and your needs. It's quite easy to hear a podcast, and sometimes it can be really good to have a podcast that has no kind of link to you. But then you spent most of your time thinking about how can I use this in my context and my world? So like the tutoring teacher one as an example, the content, as I said, is quite similar, but there's no point me talking to a tutor saying, well, here's stuff that I know works in a classroom with 30 kids in this context. Why don't you try exactly the same? That's not going to speak to them. And vice versa. If I'm talking to teachers about stuff that works in a completely different context with kind of different needs and requirements, it's hard for you to kind of relate to that content. So I would always say, if you're looking for a podcast as a start, like, be really specific. Say to yourself, like, what do you want to learn about? So when I went in, it was like, I am teaching secondary maths. That is absolutely my focus when I kind of want to do some PD podcasts. I'm going to go and find stuff about that. And if I'm not sure how to go and find that, I'm going to go to the places, people who I know I like and I trust their content. For example, like Craig Barton. Like, I've read his book. I know like a lot of his stuff really works for me. So I'm going to go and listen to his podcast. Oh, wait, there was a guest on his podcast who I really liked. I'm going to search their name in the podcast. So I'm not going to search for a topic. I'm going to search for them. Oh, they were on this podcast. I'm going to listen to that episode. But, oh, wait, they've got an episode with this guest. And before you know it, you're kind of in that world. And don't be scared. I think people sometimes with books, you kind of lose the shade. I've bought a book. That book is going to stay on my bookshelf until I've read it. I'm going to keep it there. I'm going to read it. If a podcast is not working for you, like, just stop listening and go and find another one. Like that's okay. And I think that's one of the things I really like about podcasts for teachers looking to develop. It's great autonomy. You listen to a podcast that suits you in that moment at that time. And if it doesn't suit you at that moment at that time, just pause it. Like, that's fine. It doesn't matter.
That kind of nicely segues into this next question then, because the three of us are all content creators in the sense that we create this medium of podcasting, and we all do it in the hope that we are adding value and that teachers will tune in regularly. We want them to come and listen to this. We want to add value, but that's their, we may not all admit it, but in the back of our heads, it's like, yeah, we really do want you to listen to this. So thinking about creating content now, how do you guys go about creating and balancing content that's informative and engaging whilst also keeping educators tuning in regularly? Arthur, how do you go about it? Because obviously you've got, we both got multiple podcasts, by the way. I'm humble bragging over there with the two of you. But, across both of yours, like, what's your hooks? How are you keeping those people tuned in?
So if I talk about Tea and Teaching, which I co-host with Mike, when we're talking about what content do we want to create, we try and stay true to why we started the pod and getting guests on. And we always remind ourselves of this, like, what do we want to learn about? Because if I've got a guest on who I really want to learn about what they do or how they work in their world, I'm going to be engaged with that. I'm going to want to go away and do the pre-read. I'm going to want to do the research. And that's going to kind of show in kind of being content. But there'd be nothing worse than have a podcast where they talk for half an hour, me and Mike sit there in the background, and at the end go, okay, cheers. Yeah, that was great. Bye. Like, that doesn't work. I want to be engaged. So although we do talk about listen numbers and all about Alex, like, we really try and say, like, what do we want to focus on? So we were recording some new series stuff over the summer. And when we were reaching out to guests and talk about topics, we just said, what do we want to learn about in teaching and learning right now? Let's go and do that. And hopefully everything else follows from that. But I think if you are, and it's different, I think if you are just doing it for the listeners and you're just making content for them, at some point you're going to get found out. And also it's going to become a thing that you don't want to do because you're not getting anything about it. So we selfishly try and be selfish. We're like, what do I want to learn about? Hopefully other people get some stuff out of it. And that keeps us engaged. And hopefully our engagement keeps other people engaged as a consequence.
That's the best thing about podcasting, like we've already said, all of us have said, of the people we choose to get to speak to. Like, I think that's a great way to look at it. And obviously, Shane, with yourself, it's like, even though you're doing something, a sort of slightly different field to us, it's still within an educational component. How do you approach this in terms of trying to create informative content that still captivates your listeners?
Yeah, I love that question. And I agree, with Arthur there on the selfish thing isn't a bad thing, because I do totally agree that when you're a little bit selfish about it, thinking about who you want to talk about to or what you want to discuss, you're going to have a better energy, and then your audience are probably going to pick up on that. So I do agree with that. I also, I guess I've also done a little bit of kind of audience development as well, in terms of like, I've also got like an avatar who I kind of try think about with my episodes too. So like, I know that my ideal listener is this person called Sam, and Sam's in an international school. They're in some kind of leadership position. They're probably fairly young. They're not necessarily been a principal for, 30 years. And, they're probably fairly young, got ideas, struggling with some challenges. And I kind of try to keep that in mind. And when I speak to my guests, I also tell them a little bit about Sam and a bit about what that listener might want. And I think that can sometimes help us with our discussions. Just make sure that we're helping Sam with the things that they're challenged, and we're not going off on too many tangents that might be generally interesting, but not necessarily of real value. Because when I've spoken to some of my listeners, a lot of them like coming in because they go, that was interesting. I got to action something that week. I got to use that in my role as a school leader. So, and even though I get then other listeners who are tuning in who with slightly different, I try to keep that in mind. And I think the other thing that has worked for me is being regular in releasing. So I release a weekly podcast, and I stick to that very strictly. Never miss a week. It goes out on a Tuesday. It's always there, ready for people's morning on a Tuesday morning for whatever they do. And that's when I know I get a lot of listens on Tuesday mornings from people. And I think that regularity is useful. And one reason I think it's useful, because I know from myself, sometimes if I've got a podcast that I really, really like, then you're really waiting on that content, and you're really, wanting to fit that in. Or maybe you fit it into a very specific time in your weekly commute or something. And once it's not there, but what do you do? Well, you're probably going to fill that space with another podcast. Like, that's naturally, you're not just going to sit there in silence waiting for this podcast to come back into your life. And so if you're kind of wanting people to stick with you in terms of listening, I think being fairly regular, whatever that means to you, is important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's an interesting one, actually. I've got some feedback from people that gave me that. But I'm curious, Arthur, how with the teen teaching, when do you put yours out?
So ours go out on a Monday, and we've messed around with doing it weekly, every other week, and we've had to change it over the years just to accommodate our own lives. Like when we started it, I think between mine and Mike's families, there was one kid, so we could record quite regularly. There's now 4, about to be 5. Probably when the time comes out, 5. If I don't run off in the next 10 seconds, and that's changed how we record, and that's changed how we kind of go about it. So we've gone more to, we try and record in bulk at times, and then we can use the time to edit and put those out. And I think that kind of keeps us engaged, changing the format. It also speaks to our audience, being like, we're going to change it because you're asking for different things, but our needs change as we're growing. If you've been listening to us for 3 years, which a lot of our listeners have been, you're a different educator now to where you were when you started. So as we evolve, our listeners are kind of growing and stuff like that. So I think that's the weird thing about podcasting as a hobby, as a side project, however you want to call it. I think that there's a little bit where life gets in the way. If I could record a podcast every day and put one out every day, I probably would. But that's just because I just like this format, to be honest.
I like your idea, Arthur, about the reality of that. You've got to be real about what your life, what you can do, and I think that's how you decide on how often you release, right? Is what's going to be realistic? What's going to be realistic for me? And I even found, doing once a week, I just found the editing quite challenging as well. I was struggling to fit that in as well, because that's something you've got to consider. And there's tools you can use now that make it a bit quicker. But eventually, I was lucky enough to get a sponsor just to give them a little bit of cash to pay for someone to just edit it for me. And that's kind of made it more sustainable for me. But, without that, I might not be able to keep that up.
How do you find that, Shane, in terms of kind of relinquishing that control then? Because that's the kind of flux I'm in at the moment. It's probably editing is my favorite thing. I like having the conversations, but like I say, as a camera geek, I like the editing. how have you found it over that period of time where you've just given it off to somebody else?
Yeah, I struggled at first, Alex, because I did enjoy the editing. I liked doing that. And that was great. I was just struggling for time. I think you've got to end up finding someone who really gets you and your content when you're doing it. Cause I worked with some great editors where we just didn't work out together because we just weren't quite aligned on what I was after and what they were doing. It wasn't quite right. I was very lucky to find a chap in the UK now who does my editing, and he just manages to understand exactly what I want and, exactly where I would want something cutting out. I think I'm similar to both of you. I don't heavily edit my podcast, but I needed someone who would maybe understand when it would be appropriate to kind of cut a little chunk out because there was a bit too and ahhing, or we went off on a tangent and maybe that wouldn't be the most helpful, and but without going too choppy. So it's a challenge. I've felt very lucky.
I was going to say he'd be getting rid of most of my conversations because I am always off on a tangent near enough. That's why for this one you don't see us behind the scenes, but for the three of us it's like this nice format. And I tried. This is the one of the things people don't understand, I think, either, do it in terms of structuring a podcast and how you go about putting that together. There's time and there's research we both mentioned. There's formulating questions and things like that. So I'm gonna throw this over to you two now, and again, because there's a structure to this, this is coming. In terms of our segment that we want to bring in this year, a lot more educators, schools and students as well are talking about setting up their own podcasts, and they want to do these things in school, and students themselves are really, really interested in it. So part of season 3 in this is about trying to develop a global classroom toolkit so we can provide even more value for educators. And the task I put in there for you two was about key steps for creating a professional development podcast aimed at teachers. So what would you be recommending educators should be doing in terms of planning and production? How would you go about advising them setting up their own PD podcast? Over to you two experts.
Who's going to say this first?
The number one question is, why are you making a podcast? Why are you making a podcast? Why are you not doing this as in-house CPD? Why are you not doing this as purely as a video format? Why are you not writing a book? Why are you not writing a blog? Why are you not setting up an account, whatever? Why are you podcasting? What in this format allows you to speak to people in a way that you feel is the best way to communicate? And I think if you answer that question, everything else about planning and production, it comes from that, and you can keep reminding yourself of that. So if you think the best reason is because you can have genuine conversations with people, then don't plan something that's a quick Q&A and send, here's my 10 questions, I ask, you answer, no interjections anywhere there, because that's going against why you set it up. If you're setting it up because you want a really deep dive into a topic with an expert who's coming in, well, there you go. You need to go and find that expert. You need to plan those questions. You need to bring real structure to it. But if you go in, I think, saying, I want to do a podcast, I don't know why, I'll just see what happens, I think that's you'll see it in yourself for the first couple of episodes that you lose that kind of structure. I know we absolutely did when we did ours. And we keep trying to remind ourselves of that question. And I kind of mentioned it earlier, being like, why do I want this guest, and what questions have I got to ask them? And if I remind myself that that's what this podcast is about, then everything else comes from that. I don't know about you, Shane. I don't know if that speaks to you.
It really speaks to me. I think the why is that most important thing, and will just drive where you're going, especially why on the format. I agree, not jumping to a format. I only heard a while ago of someone telling me that a leader in the school had just decided to replace some of their meetings with videos that they just send out, and it sounds innovative, but there was no why behind it, and it just annoyed people because they actually thought, well, now I can't ask the questions, and that's actually the main purpose of what I want to do in that. So sometimes you can kind of get excited around a format and not take a step back to the why. So I think you're bang on there, Arthur. I would also say that when you're then thinking of those guests or someone who you want to speak to, you'd be surprised at how many people are up for it, are up for coming on a podcast and up for a chat. You'll be really surprised. Like I think it looks way more intimidating than it is. And I am like, we've all had kind of pinch ourselves moments with guests that we've had and think, gosh, how did I get to manage it? I'd never get the opportunity to just pick up the phone and speak to that person. And they said yes. So maybe we're speaking to something that we said a bit earlier, but more of us like the sound of our own voice than we think.
I think it's some great advice to start with. Like, start with why. Simon Sinek said the best, but start with a why if you wanted to structure it. And there are some good skills that you can learn from doing it. Like, the original reason I actually go back to why I started the podcast and even doing videos was because I wanted to improve my articulation and speaking. And for those of us, obviously, we're used to speaking to cameras. I find speaking to a camera so much more challenging than speaking to a room full of people. But I felt that in terms of where I wanted to go in my education and how I was delivering my messages, my actual vocabulary wasn't strong enough. And I still do it now when I get very relaxed. I'm like, yeah, like so, as we all do. And when I listen to myself back, I get so frustrated. But there are other skill sets that you can pick up in also wanting to develop a podcast, or if it's a side project for educators or students. And as you say, if you niche your topic, if you have something particular you want to start with and you know the why of what value this will bring, and you can then communicate that to your team, then I think actually it can be a very valuable resource. And not just the only resource you have, but I think it could be a very valuable resource. But again, depending on the medium or format you choose to do, whether it's video, again, or even whether it's just audio.
I think that point of why are you starting podcasts and what can you get out of it? I think it's a brilliant question, Alex. Like, one thing I've absolutely learned from doing my podcast is like just the importance of asking questions. Sometimes, like when you're in these conference stuff, you might be worried to ask a question, as our students are, because what if no one else has got the same questions? What if I seem silly? Whereas if we were on this podcast, Alex, and you were not asking questions and we were not asking questions back, it'd be quite a short podcast. It'd be a bit weird. And I think what I've learned from it is just the importance of asking questions. Even when I think I know the answer, I ask the question that I think I know to someone who really knows their stuff, and I learn more than I thought I ever could. And that's something I've hugely taken away, of just the power of asking questions to people who are better at something than me.
Definitely. I had my kids in the car last Friday, and I was picking them up and taking them off, doing typical dad duties of moving to a birthday party, to another birthday party. Anyway, I had my own podcast on in the car. One of my kids' friends was like, "You listen to your own podcast?" And I was like, yeah, I do. Because when you're in the conversation, like we are now, like you're absorbed and you're listening and you're focused on the question or the next question. And so for me, I was like, yeah, I like to listen back because I can then learn something and continue to learn something whilst also making sure that, my quality is okay, that it's all right. But there is value in listening to your podcast back, because there's a reason why you ask those guests on. And I think actually, however, cringy or weird it may sound, but listening to it back was also helping with your learning.
That's so powerful. That really resonates with me in terms of, I think I've learned more listening back to my podcast on my own inability to listen well. Like I listen back and then I'm like, they said that, why didn't I pick up on that? Or, where didn't I follow up? And I think it's helped me to actually improve my own skill in questioning and actually being present in the interview and listening better. For sure. It's funny because it links to, I do, one of my podcasts with Jim Thompson, we launched this challenge called the 8-minute challenge, which is to record your own practice, whatever you do, whether you're a teacher, maybe you're going to record something lesson, whether you're a leader, you record a bit of your meeting, whatever it is, you record 8 minutes and then watch and then cringe and watch it back or listen to it back and then see where that takes you. Because I can guarantee you, after you get past the cringe, which will happen on the first time, the second time, the third time, after you get past that, there is great learning in there.
Yeah. Definitely. So
it sounds like we all just spend our time listening to our own podcast now. Like,
sorry,
plan a podcast, record a podcast, listen to podcasts, go to sleep,
repeat.
Listen to the podcast to send me to sleep. Maybe not quite there yet. But talking about the learning part, and that's obviously where we want to still going back to the original message. If is it Sam was there, we want to make sure we're hitting that. In terms of podcasting for professional development, there are going to be school leaders out there who go, you know what, my staff are busy, and instead of giving them books to read, we still want to offer this, but we also want to think about being maybe all things to all people. So for those school leaders who do want to promote podcast-based learning, how would you recommend they actually go about structuring these discussions and reflections as part of their PD offerings? What do you think, Shane? Start with you.
Something comes to mind straight away for me. So there is an amazing school in Bangkok called Patana School. They are a brilliant school, and they have a head of professional learning, Cindy Adair, who works with their staff, and they have these kind of alliteration kind of things. So one of them is kind of podcasts and pastries meetings that they have. They also have like pizza and pedagogy and all the different ones. But, one of them they have is getting people together. And the idea is that as you front load, you say, listen to this podcast. Maybe it's just a short podcast. Listen to it in your time when you can. And then we're just going to come together. And instead of that usual meeting where we're going to deliver something, the whole of our time together will actually be discussing and collaborating and sharing our thoughts. And actually, I think podcasts are that great way to really make the most of that time together, because we get frustrated when we're all in a room and maybe it's not quite relevant to us. And a lot of the value we take from CPD and training is when we actually get to discuss and get to apply it in our context and get to kind of think about how it works for us. So if you can devote more time to that when you are together, and then use something like a podcast on the other side, outside of that time, I think it can really supercharge that collaborative time.
Yeah. And I think if you want to, the thing I would add is if you want to use podcasts specifically as kind of a way of professional learning within your school, the brilliance of podcasting, and we've spoke about this, is the amount of stuff out there and the range of topics and the range of timing. So what I wouldn't do if you want to use podcasts is say, this is the podcast I all want you to listen to. And every week I want you to listen to this podcast. Then we're going to come in. Yeah. I would give a range of podcasts. I give a range of timeframes, styles, and different formats potentially. And you could pick a topic. So as a school leader, if you're saying, I want to do some podcasts around assessments, we'll pick a range and then bring people together to have a discussion about assessment. So rather than having a discussion about a podcast that they were mandated, you have to go and listen to this podcast, they're just going away, doing their own development, and then you're coming to have a discussion. And you'll hear people use the phrase, oh, when I was listening to that podcast you recommend, or, oh, I heard it on this podcast, and someone goes, oh, yeah, I actually picked up something differently from that. So don't use podcasts because they're great and there's loads of them, and then say you have to listen to this one podcast. I just think you're going against why you're doing that thing. So why do you want your community to have access to podcasts? And then think about what you're going to do with that. And I think giving a range is a really nice and easy way to do it.
I love that idea. I wonder if you could kind of take it further and almost give them a range of modes as well. Like whether you could be like, you could read this podcast, or here's an article, or here's a blog post, or you could really personalize it in that way.
I've done stuff within tutoring before where it's here's something to read, here's something to listen to, here's some questions to just go away and think about, because some people just want to go for a walk and just process in their own time. And again, that comes together and you get more points of views, and it just comes into this nice circle where everyone's sharing something that has spoken to them.
And the thing is as well, most podcasts now, you can get the transcript, like, depending on that. And so if you were able to do that, like you say, the modes or the formats, you could go like, here's the podcast if you want to listen to it. There's a transcript here, which, you can use AI, but I've written it, so it's condensed down nicely. You might go, right, there's 5 key questions from it for you to think about. So you could still get them thinking about the same theme, as it were, but given to them in the different modes. I like that idea. I like that idea a lot. So we've answered, I think that question has answered quite a few of the ones about the future and the advice for educators. So I'm going to move us on to kind of the fun question, because I know you've both been thinking about this. In terms of, if you could collaborate with any educator or figure in the education or for a podcast episode, who would it be and why? Arthur, what about yourself? If you could collaborate with any educator or figure in education, who would it be and why?
So I love this question when you say it to us, Alex. And I was really thinking about the process. And for me, I've got two answers. I've got someone who I'd love to talk to right now, and that is Jamie Clark, after we brought out his book, One Pages, which if you haven't got, I really would recommend you go. And I absolutely love that book. I love what Jamie's been putting out for a while. And I really would have a discussion with him about this idea of condensing these big ideas into these one pages and where he sees teachers using them. I'd be interested to see like why he creates them. I'd really like to know his why, and then have a kind of a marry up between what he thinks is happening and then get some people to share how they use them, because I know how I use them. I think that'd be really interesting. The other kind of, and I've taken figure in education. I'm going to slightly go with this, Alex. Like, I love podcasts, and I really like kind of these big idea, kind of investigative journalist podcasts, which I see as a relation kind of as education, because they're going away and they're exploring, they're learning. So, for example, like Roz Atkins, who puts out all those like little explainer videos on the BBC.
Yes.
We had him on the pod, and it was brilliant to get his insight, and there was so much overlap. And the person in that kind of vein I'd love to get on is my all-time favourite podcast is The Coming Storm on BBC Sounds. Sounds like I'm promoting it, which is kind of a deep dive into kind of the conspiracy world of America. And it's my favourite podcast series of all time. If you haven't listened to it, go and listen to it. Series 2 is out now. And I'm literally, Shane, we spoke about this. I'm waiting for Tuesday because I know that's when the next episode comes out. I'm already buzzing about it. And the guy who does that podcast, Gabriel Gatehouse, I would love to sit down and have a conversation with him about the skills that he uses and how he learnt those skills. Because investigative journalism, I think, has a lot of links to what we want our learners to do. We want them to take in facts and information, and then we want them to use that to go and do what they're passionate about. And I'd really like to have a conversation with him about, if he was working in schools, how he would teach those skills, again, to get that kind of different perspective. So 2 different answer there, and I've kind of pushed your question there, Alex, but they're the 2 names that straight away I was like, I'd quite like to talk to those people.
Very interesting. Very insightful. Shane?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've done the same. We're obviously interested in pushing out, and we're ambitious, of course. Like at the minute, I'm really obsessed with how schools work as organizations, how they function really well as like complex organizations full of like really diverse people and diverse systems. And I think it is complex work. I think there's a lot of challenge at the minute. I think we're trying to codify a lot, which is doing really well in certain regards. It's also making some things seem simpler than they are in schools. And I think that's causing some frustration in schools when the reality of the complexity of the school that I'm faced with doesn't match what I've just been told or what I've just read. And I think one person who I think is slightly outside of education, who has great work in this, is Amy Edmondson. I don't know if you heard of her, but she has a few books. She's called a book that came out this year called The Right Kind of Wrong. And she has a book that from a few years ago called The Fearless Organization. She talks a lot about psychological safety and about how that is the fundamental in all organizations, is us feeling psychologically safe, able to express, able to collaborate, able to work. And I think sometimes we get distracted on some of the technicalities of education, and sometimes actually the core of what we need to really work on is our relationships and our trust between each other, and actually that kind of safety. And I feel like I would absolutely would be a dream to speak to Amy Edmondson and kind of understand what she thinks we could do as schools to kind of make our schools much better, more efficient, more safe organizations. So yeah, slightly left out of education, but absolutely dream. So Amy Edmondson, I know you're listening. I know you're a big fan of this podcast. Please, come on, Global Ed Leaders.
I'm just going to tag her. Everything we do, everything we promote for this, we'll
Please
just tag her,
tag her,
bombard
please do
her,
that.
bombard her with everything.
Alex, what was your answer to that question? Because I'd love to know your answer as well.
I was thinking about this and just thinking, right, I know I'm going to get asked it. Mine's a bit of a different one, a left field one. Mine would be a guy called Daniel Coyle. And Daniel Coyle is an author who wrote, originally I got into it when he wrote the book called The Talent Code. And it was a really insightful book. He'd done lots of research going around the globe about why there were certain areas in the world that were real hotspots for talent. So like why are these areas in Russia really good for creating these like world-class violinists or gymnasts? Why are these areas in America, coming out with these type of athletes and all these different things about what our understanding of talent is. And it was just fascinating. And then he wrote a follow-up book a few years later called The Culture Code. And that came out, a few years ago. But again, a very similar thing, just talking and really dissecting about culture, very similar to what lots of the business leaders do, like Simon Sinek's do in terms of really diving into this idea of culture. And I would love to speak with them about obviously going into school and how we can utilize his research and findings about talent and about culture and apply them to education on a broader perspective. Because I think, actually, like you guys have said, sometimes like it's a very metaphorical story now. This is a story of a young boy who wants to learn about success, and basically his mum and dad go to this wise man. He goes off to the wise man, has this conversation, and basically he lives in this fantastic area of the world. And he says, go and explore everything, go and eat, go and cook, go and see, go and listen. And he says, before you go, takes out his pocket, gives him a spoon and pours some oil on the spoon. And he says, but don't let anything drop. Anyway, the guy goes around, the kid comes back a couple of hours later, and this wise man says to the kid, how did you enjoy everything? And he goes, I didn't notice anything. I was too busy focusing on the oil on my spoon. So obviously sends him back again, has a look around, and he takes everything on board and says, this is amazing. For me, the moral of that story is that sometimes in education, we are so engrossed on the oil on the spoon, the what's happening in that very small part, that we miss all those wonderful things that are going on around us. And we sometimes need to take our step up and see the perspective. And I think having that idea with Daniel Coyle talking about talent and culture and all the other things he does, and how that could fit in a broader perspective as education as a whole, or rather than just a school, I think that would be a fantastic conversation.
It's a really nice story, Alex. It makes me think of we were talking about getting guests on the podcast, so slightly reverting back there. And it sounded like, I think it made it sound like I choose or we choose the guests and then we go for them. And I would also say to podcasts, kind of on what you're saying there, Alex, like it's go away and find other people who you aren't necessarily you're aware of, or get people to recommend. And I've had guests recommended to me, had a quick chat with them on Zoom or Riverside, and within 2 minutes gone, that I have to have this person on the podcast. Yeah. And I think that's one thing I would recommend to podcast listeners, to podcasters, to schools who recommend podcasts. As you said, don't just focus on the spoon in front of you, go and look elsewhere, because that's often where we learn the most. And it's interesting, isn't it? Each one of us recommended someone who necessarily isn't. I taught GCSE English for 10 years.
Yeah. And I think even with that, sorry, Shane, it's okay to say no as well. I think whether you guys have been there as well, and you've had people approach you or companies approach you or individuals, and it's like, okay, it sounds interesting, but then be confident enough in your why and go, you know what? And I've had to say it recently to someone, it's like, and they were pushing and wanting certain things. I was like, I'm really sorry, but I don't think what you want aligns with how I run my podcast. It's okay to say that as well, because it's like we say, we do this for value for listeners and for our personal learning. And if we don't think we're going to get anything out of it, it's okay to say no, isn't it?
I just love that. That's so important. And it is funny. You get you launch a podcast, and because podcast is not like YouTube and things like that, people can't see your data or whatever. So once you've got a that makes it quite nice. It's quite equal playing field in that sense. But it also can sometimes, as soon as you've got a podcast, you may get barraged by companies who want to sell things, who are desperate to be on your podcast, whether it's relevant or not. And the temptation can be to go, oh, good, I don't have to think about a guest this week because this person's approaching me. But you've got to be careful of that, because are you, to your audience, are you really meeting what they're coming to your podcast for, because they don't have to be loyal. We've recommended them not to be loyal. But more importantly than that, I think to yourself, right? What's the point? You didn't set a podcast up to go speak to these random companies. That's not why you set it up. So remember that and kind of hold true to that. I think that's such a good point.
Amazing, gents. Well, time is precious across these 3 different time zones on a Friday.
It's Friday night here.
I was going to say, we can see it's kind of all just gone dark for you as we've watched this go through. Hopefully, this will be one of a few where we got to get together and we find times to really help educators out there who are interested in podcasting and as today looking at how they can use it as professional development. And hopefully we can have a few more conversations in this series about supporting people who want to do podcasts and the other types of ways in which they can use them as well. But for now, Arthur, Shane, thank you ever so much for joining me on this and adding your insight. Really, really appreciate it. Go off and have wonderful days and weekends and all the best for the future mini more that's coming shortly.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alex. The More household is about to get a lot more crazy.
Even more crazy.
Even more now there's a podcast name. There we go.
So it could just be you and 3 kids roaming around going crazy.
Sounds a dream. All for it.
Well, this conversation has been a dream. Thank you.
It's been awesome. Thanks, guys. You take care now.
You too.
Brings us to the end of this fascinating episode of the International Classroom. I hope you found the conversation with Arthur and Shane as valuable as I did. Now, we've covered everything from creating your podcast voice to structuring content that keeps educators coming back for more. And also, a huge thank you to Smart Technologies for their continued support. And remember, Smart is helping teachers and students around the world connect and collaborate through innovative tools. And you can explore more at smarttech.com. As well, if you've enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the International Classroom on your favourite podcast platform and leave us a review. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn for more insights and episodes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep sharing your passion for education.